Did you remember those Post-it notes you could put on your desktop?
Oh
On like
yeah.
Windows,
What
you
was
could
it?
put little yellow
Windows?
sticky notes.
It's like these systems work so well in real life. Let's like just like completely translate it one to one to digital world.
Well, you remember when the calendar had like leather at the top, and like when you
Yeah.
change months, it like tore the page away.
What is that called? It's like a name for it, like skeuomorphic or
Yeah,
something.
yeah,
When
yeah.
it,
Resemble like light shining on it in a realistic way, I guess. Dude,
yeah.
the page tearing animation would actually be pretty fun to build in like Framer Motion, you know?
How would you do that? Would that be like? Would it mainly be like images, like
I think
sprites?
you'd
Or
have to use React 3.js because it'd be like a 3D tear.
I see. So like that, you have like the actually like you see the words on the sheet, but the perspective changes as like they
Yeah.
tear away. Cool.
I guess you might be able to do that with like Z transforms too in CSS. I'm not actually sure because you can like skew things. But I want, and I think you could animate like the translate Z. So that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, fun one.
Awesome. Well, how's it going, man? It's been a while. I mean, I
Been
see
a
you every
while.
day, so I know how
I
you're
know.
doing. But how is it going out there in podcast land?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, we've been doing a lot of Next.js.
Yeah. Yep. We've been working on some consulting work. Been doing some consulting work and well, some video work, but not as much the last few weeks. It's been nice here in New York. It's always harder to work when it's 70 degrees and low humidity in the summer. It's wonderful. And I had some family visiting, so I've been off my creator game here. But I'm working on a new video about buttons, and we can chat about that. But we've been doing some consulting as well. That's been taking up most of our work time, so we can talk about some cool stuff there too. Well, I want to talk about the button video I'm working on. So this is like it's just one of those classic rabbit holes. You think like it's going to be something easy, and it's just completely, it's just so much more complicated than you think. Partially because like good UX does take a lot of time, but partially because of browsers, basically. Sometimes I wonder how much happier we'd be if we were iOS developers.
I don't know. I think everyone has their, the bad parts of their system, and ours
Yeah.
just happen to be like normalizing UI events across a billion different devices.
Yeah. iOS development also makes our life harder because we basically end up playing catch up in a lot of ways because people are used to high quality apps on like the iPhone. So for my side projects and my experiments, my YouTube videos, I usually end up doing stuff on the iPhone because that's my phone and I like using my web apps on the phone. And this all started with this strength training app that we both use actually at the gym now. And, you log your exercises. And it's basically a simple app with a few forms. And the main form you use felt strange at the gym. It felt strange to use. So I wanted to improve it. And it's a dynamic form. So you can add sets of like a bench press. And every time you click the button, you add a row to the form. And if you just use a button by default and you click on it in the web, it's like pretty bad. It's pretty bad. Most buttons on the web are like links, right? So, well, I mean, not most, but in websites anyways, I was just looking at sites that I respect, seeing how the interaction is when you press a button. And a lot of times it's a link. So there's enough changing and the browser's doing enough that there's enough feedback. But for something like this form, where you're on the same page and you press a button and the thing changes. First of all, you tap it. It's like people have just come to expect forms on the web to feel weird, And then you go back to like your iOS apps and they feel great. Anyways, you press the button and it happens instantly. You don't know if you really pressed it. Sometimes you missed it. Sometimes it doesn't register as a press or a tap. And then if you do, you pressed it because the row added, but the button doesn't feel satisfying. Like there's these principles in the human interface guidelines from Apple that are like, when you swipe an app, it should feel heavier than swiping a screen. Like when you tap a button, there should be immediate response to anything that you use a gesture to initiate because it's supposed to mimic things in the real world. All these different things. And the button literally feels like you're just tapping like the glass. It just feels like you're just tapping something and you don't even know if you tapped the button or not the button. And it just bothered me, you know? Were you going to say something?
Is a problem here that your form doesn't have navigation? Like if your form was like submitting data to a server and then rendering a new page, or your form was triggering some state that rendered like an if statement that made the form disappear and data pop up, would that be okay? Or what is like, I just want to like.
I actually think this is, well, it's the add set button from the app. So you've seen that before. But I think one way to talk about this is like, it might be the hardest class of buttons to get right, because if you use a button as a link, like let's say the homepage of like a documentation site says get started, right? You click on it, you're expecting to navigate somewhere. And so the page transitions. And so when you're using like a server rendered app, you get the browser Chrome to show you that. When you're using a client rendered app, usually it's really fast. And maybe you like transition to the new route and show a skeleton screen right away. But you're not really needing feedback from the button per se. So that's like a navigation button, like a link that basically is styled like a button. Then you have buttons that are for like asynchronous actions, like submitting a form that takes a long time. And usually those receive more of our attention, right? We just did a load more button on the project we're working on, and it shows dots while it's loading more data to display, right? We spent a lot of time on that button in the sense that you want it to tap, you want to show the loading spinner, you want it to stay the same height. It's satisfying to press, both on desktop and on mobile, right? And it follows that principle of showing you immediate feedback and communicating like what's going on. But if you have a button that is doing something synchronous, right? It's not asynchronous. It doesn't take any time, but it's not navigation. I think that might be a pretty tough. That might be a pretty tough space to be, or at least that's the space that receives the least attention.
Well, it receives the least feedback from the system, from the environment.
Right. Exactly. Because there's not a navigation and there's not a long running task. And so it also receives like the least attention in the sense that you have a button that like toggles a panel, people just do it, right? And it works, and it's just button on click, no problem, set state. Now with like collapsible panels, there are some elements you kind of expect to happen immediately. Like you tap on it and it just does something immediately. But what I realized when I was thinking about why I didn't like this form so much when I was at the gym, like you're using it, and again, there's just this feeling of, it feels like a website that's like, have you ever seen someone like use a website, like fill out some crappy form on like an airline site or a checkout, some bad checkout, and you know, you don't feel confident in what you're doing, and like you tap a button and it's like highlighting the text of the button by accident, or it zooms in when like it shouldn't, like you're zooming into an input and like the form like is now zoomed in and fills up the whole, like more than the whole screen. Yep. Or you know, like all these, you know, you long press a button and yeah, the magnifying glass shows up, and like you're just, it's like there's this anxiety, there's just this, because it's a general flakiness feeling of websites versus apps, where if you watch people use apps, type on the keyboard, the on-screen keyboard, all these things, there's a lot of confidence there, there's a lot of precision, and the feedback is always so good. And a lot of that's because, you know, the platform has more constraints. Like when you're in an iPhone screen, you don't have to worry about, am I scrolling this arbitrary page, or am I trying to navigate, or do I need to show, like, I need to respond to like OS level gestures, like swiping back and forward, or like showing a new app versus scrolling my page or scrolling like a navigation within my website. So the constraints help, but just the general flakiness. And so that's what I was noticing in this part where in particular is button tap. So what I started doing was I noticed this button tap was one of the things that made this page feel flaky. And I was looking on iOS and other native apps for how they handle synchronous button presses. So not buttons that do a loading state, and not buttons that navigate, or even buttons that navigate on iOS. They slide the screen in.
Yeah, I mean, you spend a lot of time with like the calculator app. I think that's a good example of a synchronous button press.
Yep.
You press 9 shows up in the calculator.
Yep. But even before that, like in messages and phone, if you click edit, like you click edit and you show a modal. That's like synchronous. That's like something we would just do as a button. But on the native phone, you hit edit and the text, like it fades out and then fades in. Like it's subtle. It probably takes like 350 milliseconds. But even though there's a modal starting to slide up from the bottom of the screen, the edit button doesn't just stay there. Like you feel like you pressed the edit button regardless of what's happening. So you have the satisfaction and the confidence that you did what you were trying to do in that moment. Or hitting plus on like a new message or something like that. All those buttons, even if you tap them super fast, it has that feedback. Whereas on the web, we do things like hover states because we're designing our computer. A lot of times we had hover. Most buttons on the web have hover states because we're sitting here designing like this. And so that's great because you know when you're about to tap it, you've already hovered it. That's almost like the equivalent feedback. But on mobile, or if you just click a button really quick, that's the other thing, right? If you click a button, even if you're hovered, sometimes you darken it even more when you click it. And if you click it long enough, if the mouse down is long enough, something like an active pseudo state would be good to show you. But a lot of times you just tap really quick. And that was the thing that I realized. Tapping really quick oftentimes will not be long enough to trigger or even make the active state visual. And we don't have hover on mobile. So we don't have hover on mobile. So when you tap, you're back to that same spot. So that's what I wanted to fix. And because basically no iOS control behaves that way. So what I started doing was using Framer Motion to trigger an animation on tap, on click basically. And the animation would make the background fade in and fade out. And so like you said, the calculator app is a great example. It's a very dramatic animation when you tap a number in the calculator app, but I want to apply this to my every button, but this is a nice one to explain the details. And so, yeah, on the calculator, you can tap and hold and the number changes. You can tap it really quick, as fast as possible, and it'll trigger a complete animation. It doesn't like transition a little bit and then cancel it and go back. It goes all the way. And you can tap and hold, and if you want to change your mind, again, this is something you'll notice if you watch people use their iPhones. Like they press submit, and then they move it off and they let go. They don't want to actually submit it.
It's like the chess move.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Haven't left your hand off of it yet. So all those things are things that are useful. Like I can wait to determine if I'm going to do it. I can cancel a button press. And if I tap it, I have a lot of feedback. And if you look at most sites and you use it, most of them on the mobile web, like most buttons don't do that stuff. And it actually makes them feel pretty bad.
Well, just you saying that, like what happens on the web if I press a button, keep my hand pressed down, my finger pressed down, and then I drag the cursor outside of the button? And
I mean, this is the thing. It depends, of course, is the answer. If you use just literally a button
on click. Yeah.
Browsers do things differently, so there's not even consistency there. If you don't... basically, if you, so if it's a link, it'll open the link in like a new tab. So that's kind of can be a little weird, but that's a link, so that's fine. But most buttons will actually trigger the user selection. You know, the way you would if you long press over text. Most buttons don't apply user select :none CSS property to them. And so when you long press, the magnifying glass shows up, which is obviously never what you want. You never want to have the user select the text in the button.
It's so funny. It's like literally never what you want.
Literally
you want like
never
anything else.
Yes,
not that.
Truly. So most buttons are not even going to get that right. So you don't even have time to see what they do if you go off, because you're already selecting the text. So if you try to move your finger off, you're not even in press mode at that point. If you do that and let go, you haven't even tapped the button. You're just selecting text. So that's one problem, right? And there's another problem, which is people use hover states on desktop. And if you're not careful on mobile, those get applied when you tap. And they stay there because basically when you tap, the hover pseudo state gets applied by iOS. So you tap it and you've hit the button, but now it looks like it's active after you let go. And iOS even asynchronously will blur an element to remove a focus state. Sorry, I guess this is it focus state or hover? No, it's hover state. But iOS, I think, will blur asynchronously some amount of time after on click to remove focus from buttons after they're tapped. And I think it's basically to avoid this behavior in some cases, like to avoid keeping it focused and having a state applied to it.
When you say iOS, do you mean
Mobile Safari?
Mobile Safari. Okay.
Yeah. So if you have if you have added the user select none to your button, then what happens is, well, actually, I'm curious. Without I can't find a site right now, but the whole behavior of iOS of pressing and then leaving, swiping out and then swiping back in, that's like very hard to do, and it doesn't do it by itself. That's not how buttons work, basically. There's all sorts of inconsistencies for that to work in desktop and browser. So anyways, this whole rabbit hole led me to these series of blog posts from the React Aria Spectrum folks, React Spectrum folks, which they have this library React Spectrum, which is their Adobe-specific UI library design system, and React Aria, which is like the building blocks for that, like the decomposed pieces that are like unopinionated styles, but all the functionality, kind of like headless UI, right? But for all these little tiny pieces. And one of them is this series of blog posts on building a button. It's this 3-part blog post series and talks all about this stuff. And I'm just cracked the surface. Like, basically, it's pretty crazy. You start going down this road, and well, they have a use button hook that does it all for you, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, that's what my video is going to be on. It's pretty sweet. And this is like the button. I'm going to make a button that I'm going to use for literally every button in every project I do going forward, because it feels so much better, and it's headless.
And now you have one more button. Now you have 11 ways to write a button.
No. It's going to be the only one.
Yep. I have a question where,
you have a lot of questions.
Yeah. How did we get here? Like, is this just emergent kind of, you have different browsers, you have different devices, and they all just sort of different ways of interacting, cursor versus touch, and this sort of behavior about like how a button works just naturally emerges from like each individual platform?
I think so. I think touch devices weren't something that was like foreseen by like spec authors when they were doing this stuff. And then, right.
Yeah. And nor should that be, right?
Right. But when touch devices came out, and devices are competing with each other, so iPhone Mobile Safari wants like Safari to feel like browsing the web when they launch iPhone. They have to choose how things behave and how Mobile Safari is going to handle a button element. And so they do their best or whatever. But yeah, I think again it goes back to like the constraints. Like in iOS, if you were building an iOS app and you run your button, you don't have to worry about making it not text selectable, because that's what it's for. It's a button. I guess the reason buttons have text select on by default in Mobile Safari and other places is because like it's just the web is like it's a blank canvas, and all these CSS, they apply some default CSS rules, but more often than not, they don't apply things to any opinions you could consider an opinion. And yeah, so, I think it's just emergent, new devices coming out, and yeah, but it's weird, frustrating, because it's also like HTML wasn't really designed as an app platform SDK. It was like documents. So yeah, and I also think like those kinds of behaviors, like that is a pretty sophisticated UX. Like those micro interactions, the details of that button press in an app like Calculator on iOS, there's a lot going on there, and that wasn't something that even existed before. So maybe when Safari is making these decisions, they weren't even considering these things at the beginning. Yeah. So basically, go ahead.
I was gonna say, well, even given all that, it is pretty cool that there is a way to normalize all this so that you feel like you can end up with one button, even though it's your 11, even though it's your 11th button. You feel like you can end up. No, but it is cool that like over time there's a way to the APIs are low level enough that over time we can we can normalize all this, all the different devices, all the different interactions into a single button.
It's jQuery for buttons, basically, this particular hook. And there are, like, these will make it back into the standard. Once it's just like the whole Web Manifesto thing. And like as the ways people use things converge, those do make it back into the platform. So like Focus Visible is a great example where, you know, you have focus styles, you're focusing with the keyboard, and then sometimes when you have a mouse or touch device, the question is like, should I apply focus styles? Browsers handle it differently. And so then you're like, it takes you some years, but the community realizes what I actually want is like an, what do they call it? An input, not input mode. It's the modality, the input modality, which is like, basically, am I using a keyboard, a mouse, or a touch device? Or an assistive technology like a screen reader. So if you're using a screen reader and the focus styles, exactly. So so you can see why they would say, oh, okay, we have to like manage focus on mobile Safari, so we're going to focus a thing, and then you want to style the focus for like power users who use a keyboard or like screen readers or whatever. And then it's like, well, now it's like what we realize is I actually want to know if I focused it with the keyboard or if an element has focus because I've tapped it. So then you realize like the focus state of an element, whether it's focused, is different from whether I want to style the focus state. And so now we have focus visible, which is was it focused, which input modality was used at the time the element received focus. Even like if you tab out of a browser window and tab back, like what element has focus? Should it regain focus so you know where you were, which button is selected, and should I style that? So now CSS is getting focus visible, right? And so that's an example of how like these things develop organically. People use them. You know, the jQueries of the world come out, and then the browsers realize what the good APIs are as best they can. It's, you know,
that's like an awesome system. Very like very emergent, very like self-correcting.
Totally.
It just takes a long time, and there's a lot of frustration for web developers. But it is a really awesome system.
It is, and it does move faster than a lot of things if you think about it. And it's like there's no one picking winners and losers. I mean, guess the CSS spec authors and the JS ECMAScript committee or whatever, but it's in good hands, right? They do a good job of giving us for the most part, good job giving us lowest level things with consistent APIs. And libraries like React and all these other things, and Tailwind can smooth things out, but they have the ability to do so. What was I going to say?
I have a question while we're on this.
Yeah.
Are there, from doing the button stuff, is there anything you learned that you think would be like a good candidate for being like baked into the browser?
Well, they're already working on that. So like that was going to be what I was about to say. So nice alley-oop. The the click. With the button, you do on click, right? And then you say, okay, now we have touch devices. And so I guess when like mobile Safari is like when a user taps a button, that's going to trigger the on click event. But then it's like there's different things too, because I want to know if I move my mouse over the button and left it, but there's no mouse on a phone. So when do I fire a mouse move or mouse enter, a mouse leave event on the iPhone? And it's like you don't, because you don't have a mouse. So then you have like a touch move, and you have like a touch enter and touch leave events on the iPhone. So you can know, again, like for building these kinds of things, whether the user's like dragging into and out of an element. And then you have like a press event. Or like you want to know whether I'm pressing it, again, back to input modality versus clicking it. But imagine if every time we wrote a button in React, instead of just doing on click, we had to, think about every modality or whatever. So they have like on pointer down and on pointer up. So the pointer events is a new like event API that are supposed to basically standardize across different stylus, touch surfaces, mouses, things like that. And so they have things like an active. They have all these different things. I mean, they have like the tilt X and tilt Y, the pressure, right? It's kind of like you could eventually imagine something like an on pointer down or something like that instead of on click. It probably will never happen, but even thinking about it now and working on this, like on click is kind of weird because it's really on tap. Oh yeah, tap is what you get. There's like on tap, there's on click. So anyways, it's kind of like, it's like a never ending evolution because there's new inputs that come out. But the pointer API is exactly like what you're talking about. It's like another example of these standards, emergent organic standards being rolled back into the platform.
Very cool. And the pointer basically like captures, like, it's like if it was a hierarchy underneath it would be like mouse and touching and
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. It says pointer events is a W3C recommendation that describes events and related interfaces for handling hardware agnostic pointer input from devices, including a mouse, pen, touchscreen, etc. For compatibility with the existing mouse-based content, the spec also describes a mapping to fire mouse events for other pointer device types. So yeah, you can see this is like as things get more complex and we get more screens and inputs and all that stuff, it gets rolled in. Just like media queries got rolled in once it was like, oh, we need to build websites for all different sizes. So now we need to be able to use like media queries to do responsive design. So it's pretty cool. But things like pointer events and even focus visible are even today not implemented consistently across browsers. So just like headless UI helps give you like a dialogue element, even though like there's a dialogue maybe going to come to the browser eventually, but we can use it today with headless UI. React Aria gives you all these other things, and one of them is this use button. And it has, the button you get there has press. They call it press. So if you're pressing a button, you're pressing it with a mouse or a touchpad or your hand or a stylus. So that's kind of a cool unified API. I like that name. And they have on press, and they have like, for specifically this calculator example, they have on press end and on press start that gets triggered if you either mouse down and keep it held down and move it on and off, or you touch and move your finger on and off. So now you can apply the styling, and then you can also get an on press, which happens when you let go on the button, whether you have left and come back or you're just tapping it for the first time.
Cool.
It's pretty awesome, man. And it really makes a difference. Honestly, like I was just playing with my little calculator demo I'm doing, like the clone of the iOS calculator. And then I was going to some of my apps, and it's like, it really makes a difference. It makes you realize how brittle so much of the mobile web feels just because of these basic things. So from that perspective, it's like, yeah, I mean, I just opened up my fitness app and clicked that calendar button, and it's like, if you tap it, you start selecting like the text of the days of the week. Like, it doesn't make any sense. If I tap down the activity toggle, it shows like the magnifying glass. Yeah, it's just funny.
Can you talk a little about how
if I long press, sorry, I'm just loving how embarrassing this is. If I long press, yeah, I'm gonna hold up the zoom for you. Like if you long press like my tabs, like it doesn't work. First of all, like if you tap it, it works, but if you long press it, nothing happens. Like no feedback. And also you can see that little magnifying glass back there. See that little square? Yeah. And then you let go, you get a piece of haptic feedback because it's like zoomed in, and then nothing happens. So it's just funny. I think that's where like people just have the subconscious part of their brain that's expecting this flakiness. And so they're much more careful, and they have to use a lot more of their brain energy to make sure they don't do something wrong, submit a bad form, lose their data, whatever. So.
Interesting. I think that's true. I've never really thought about that, true. But yeah.
You're navigating around the web and trying something, and you see. I mean, I was with my dad. He was in town, and we went to do City Bike on a ride on the West Side Highway, which was awesome. And he didn't have City Bike app installed. It was insane what he had to go through to sign. He was like, he had to like choose his pronouns. He just wanted to ride a bike. He had to put in his credit card and birthday information. He's like, we're like ready to get on a bike. I'm like, come on, guys, this is ridiculous. But But even worse was like just selecting the inputs, next. And I mean, all those little things that are just much, much different compared to, being on an iPhone, like, and using a native app. So, yeah, it's really cool. So anyways, all that to say, there's this use button hook that you can use inside of a component, splat the button props on, and then you get the on press unified interface. It applies user select none when you're pressing. So you don't even have to like add user select none Tailwind class or whatever, and figure out when you want to apply that and all this stuff. It just applies it when you're interacting with the button, and then it removes it when you let go, which is awesome. So you don't have to think about it.
How does the API work? Where do you write on press? Do you do like do you write
use
that
button,
in like
options
use button?
for use button?
So you'd write on press there, and then you'd get back an object that you then splat into your button.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. It's really easy. And what else do they do? So they do the thing where, yeah, if you move your finger on and off the button, it works, and it works with the mouse. And they do something. Oh, there's something else that they actually don't do, but I learned by reading their actual design system button, which is something else that can happen is you press a button and you drag for whatever reason. You start pressing a button and you drag and it starts scrolling the page. This was like really apparent in some other app. I can't remember which one, but again, you want that feedback and you don't want to scroll the page when you're on the button. So there's a class called touch none in Tailwind, which is touch action : none. You throw that on your button and then it doesn't trigger scrolls anymore because you're tapping a button, right?
Yeah, that's a great example of like I press a button and then it's like the chess move thing. I don't want to do this, so I want to drag my hand outside of the click area and let go.
You start scrolling the page.
So not only do you not get to like unpress a button, but then some other interaction starts. It's very confusing.
Yep. Super confusing. And again, it doesn't happen in native apps. So that's the main. Oh, and then focus. So again, I'll link all the we'll link all that blog post series because there's even more devils in the details. But one of them is that because of the way that thing works, where iOS Safari can like blur an element programmatically, and also because different devices, different browsers handle focus differently. They don't always focus all the elements. Even Safari doesn't let you tab through elements unless you have a checkbox selected, but sometimes even then, not with forms. So there's a lot of times you can't even tab to elements in Safari if you're not set up with like a very specific device. They control focus management programmatically. And again, headless UI does this too. So like focus management is super important for all sorts of reasons. And for example, in headless UI, you click a button, the menu comes down. You want to be able to start using your arrow keys to select an option. So that's focus management. So you have to go from the menu, from the button that initiated the menu, to the menu, which is probably rendered in portals. It's very far away. So you have to programmatically focus that. So even if you're like just using Rails and you're just writing HTML by hand and using the browser, you still actually need JavaScript to make like an accessible website in the most broadest sense of the word, one that feels good to use and feels like a native app, someone that anyone like who uses a keyboard, power user, or assistive tech otherwise would want. And so you have to use JavaScript for that. And then when you hit escape on the menu or a dialog, you want to go focus to go back to the button that opened it. So you have to remember the button that triggered the modal or the dialog, so you can start tabbing around again and get back to your things. So you have to use JavaScript for all that. And so he talks about these focus management issues with like the programmatic blur and all that stuff, and says basically, for this reason, we prevent default on like every like on click or mouse down, which is usually by default how browsers move focus to the element. And then so we have to programmatically call like element.focus to smooth all of these things out. And because of that, you don't get to use, this was like one wrinkle I've had when making this button, you don't get to use the focus visible variant, like in Tailwind, which really just means you don't get to use the focus variant, focus visible CSS pseudo class. Because when you focus things programmatically, that's how some browsers treat that. Actually, that's not even the same thing. So even that is inconsistent, whether browsers apply focus visible to things that were tabbed programmatically focused. So even if you're so Tailwind has focus visible, right, which we start to use, and there's a polyfill if you're using older browsers, so that we can apply focus styles only when the keyboard. So you don't get that annoying thing where you tap with a mouse and then the button like it hovers or goes active and it has a ring to focus. Like that's weird. That's broken behavior. It's not what the purpose of a focus ring is for, and it's really confusing when you do that on elements on the web. And so that's why we started using focus visible, and why focus visible is getting added to the spec. But even still today, both because you have to programmatically focus certain elements to make an actual website, and because mobile browsers handle focus visible differently, focus visible is actually not even like a good. You can use it today, and like it can, I guess, progressively fall back to whatever the browser does if it doesn't support focus visible, but it's not going to be consistent.
You need like the focus visible JavaScript API. Sorry, the focus JavaScript API needs
so that's
to take
what they have.
Modality.
That's what they have.
You can say like
it's called use focus ring, and it gives you focus props, and it tells you whether it's focused, and it gives you an is focused and it is focused visible. Where is focused visible means what you want it to mean as an app developer, which is, did I focus the element with a keyboard, basically.
Interesting. Okay.
So now you can use focus ring and apply a focus ring when the modality is a keyboard, and it doesn't apply the ring when you tap a button with a mouse or when you tap it on the web with your iPhone.
One thought that's going through my head right now is it's like really scary that anyone, whatever library you're using, has to like prevent default, and then it feels like they're having to rebuild like all this from the ground up.
Yeah, it is scary. He talks about it in the blog post, and basically says like there's a chance, soon we'll be able to. We hope to be able to remove this code and use focus visible. Just tell people to use focus visible. But until things are consistent, we can't do that, because you can't use focus visible for 75% of the cases. But then when it comes to all these other areas where you have to do programmatic focus, like you are having a completely different paradigm. We want one paradigm to do that, and this is how we do it. So I agree, but this is like powering Adobe's design system, and it has like folks working on it full time. It's extremely well maintained and well documented right now. I mean, we all know open source, it has problems with sustainability, but these low-level things are like, it's like browser APIs on steroids. Like, it's pretty awesome. And I haven't even looked at all of them, but they compose very well together. They usually have like a hooks version and like a render props version. So like they have like the use focus ring, which gives you like is focus visible. And so you could like throw that into like a ternary, into like an expression on class name. They also have like a focus ring component that you can just wrap around your button or your input, and throw some classes on there, so you don't even have to deal with the state. And it's actually kind of cool. You just like get to put the focus classes on the focus ring, and then your CSS is like really just like the styles you're using is like for the main interaction with like the mouse or touch.
If you're using the component version, you put the props on the component, and you
don't even do the props anymore. You just wrap your button in focus ring, and then you add like focus ring classes. And so with Tailwind, instead of doing like focus : ring, it would be like focus ring component, and then there's a prop called focus ring classes, and you would just throw like ring, ring 2, ring gray 800, and then inside the immediate children is your button with like the button props from use button, and it's pretty awesome.
When focus happens, they'll get the class names from the focus ring component applied to the button.
Exactly. I think that is.
So this composes.
Yes.
You can compose this with Tailwind. Like, you don't have to step outside of like utility classes.
100%. The component is actually a convenience wrapper around use is focused if you happen to be styling with class names, which is cool because we use Tailwind. That's what we do. Mm-hmm. Calculator V5. Let me see if this gets a new element. Yeah, it gets it applied to it. Pretty cool. That's awesome. I actually didn't. I forgot to even look at that. That's very neat. So you tab to the thing, and focus ring just applies the styles to its first child, which is
no like inserted div or anything.
right. Exactly. Cool. Pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool how they have like a use hover. They have all sorts of stuff, and you can just like use button props. Use is focused props. You can splat them all in. They work together. It's really impressive, and like the docs are really good. They're really well written, and those blog posts are incredibly well written too. I really enjoyed it, so I'm gonna put those up there.
Awesome.
I was I've been really impressed so far with library. The last thing, which I did. This is great because I have a meeting here in like 10 minutes to jump to. But the last thing that I found, even from Adobe's version of the button, with all of these pieces layered in so that it gets focus, management, and all this stuff, it doesn't do the thing that I wanted it to do. And maybe this is like not appropriate, I guess. But the very reason that led me down this whole exploration in the first place was wanting to tap that add set button in my app and have it glow for a little bit so that I know I pressed it. You know, it works if you press it long or if you hold it, you can see. But I wanted that iOS behavior where when you tap something, you get about 500 milliseconds of feedback that you actually clicked it, even if you went like this, right? It barely touched it. So, you know, usually when we're using Tailwind or just CSS on hover, we do something like transition, hover background blue, right? So you hover over it and there's a transition where the background transitions to the blue and then it comes back. But again, if that takes 500 milliseconds, CSS transitions are like, they're transitions between two states. If you tap it, depending on how long you press it, you only have as long as you pressed it to transition to the active state. And then as soon as you let go, it's going to immediately transition back. So this behavior of like you see on the iPhone here, I'll just throw the, if you're watching on YouTube here, you'll be able to see. And everyone knows this. You just go to the calculator and you press a button, right? And it has this very nice, satisfying thing. Even if it doesn't matter if I let go or I just tap it, right? That's a really nice thing. And that's, again, in all these different buttons. So the Aria button doesn't have that. The React Spectrum button has like everything. It stops you from scrolling. It lets you slide on and off. But if you go to the button and you hit it really fast, like there is I can just looking at it right now. I can press it and I see it, but if you tap it really fast, I want that feedback. There should be something built in. It's almost like the Google buttons, how they do that puddle thing.
The wave.
Yeah, the wave, exactly. That's like, I don't like that particular implementation, but the idea behind the Google Wave is that you are confident you actually tap the button. There is a 500 millisecond period of feedback that I don't have to say, did I actually tap it? Because if you tap this thing, you don't actually know
how long the button is active for.
Exactly.
That's the point.
Regardless of how long the button is active for. Exactly. So my implementation of this calculator thing is basically, in this video, the YouTube video I'm going to make, is the next one, is basically going through some of these things, calling it out, showing how use button solves all these things, showing how it feels on a web app, on the phone, on the computer, and how much better it is, and then saying, okay, well, how do we do this? Well, this is where framer motion comes in. And basically, you can wire up an animation. So this is another thing that I kind of learned, which is like just how to think better about when to use transitions and when to use animations, right? Are you kicking off an animation or are you transitioning between states?
Yeah.
So that's like, we reach for transitions when we're doing things, but you really think about it. It's like, is there like an event that led to an animation or are you doing states? It's almost like in React, you know?
Yeah, totally. I never even asked myself that question. I'm just like, oh, I need to animate this. And like kind of decision tree is, can I use a CSS transition for this? But in like the example you're bringing up, I'm not transitioning.
Exactly.
And so I never asked myself that.
Yep. So what you want is basically on press, you want to trigger an animation. And press, again, is the unified API for the event that would happen when you let go of either the pointer or the touch input. And this is why it was actually really hard for me in the beginning, because when we animate things in framer motion, 99% of the time we're doing state-based animations. We're not triggering state-based transitions. We're not triggering animations. So Framer motions, like the core APIs is like, here's the initial value of scale and background color and opacity. And here's the value you animate to based on some state. And so now you can have React state is checked, do this, otherwise do this. That's state-based. That's a transition, basically. But here, you can kind of contort the declarative state-based API to get something to run regardless of the state. So we did this on our checkbox where like you tap it and you want to actually trigger the grow, but you want to trigger something to happen in the new state, even though it ends up off the page. So it's not really like it's here in state A and it's here in state B. It's like you want this thing to run. And it was weird for us to get that to work with the declarative APIs.
Yeah. You know what's really interesting here is like this is like kind of a theme that comes up in React a lot, where think about like just remove animation from this. You click a button and you're saving a form. We want to like at that point we want to write imperative code. We want like a handle save or a handle submit function, and in there it's going to call fetch, or it's going to call some like save function we got back from a hook. It's going to await that. Then it's going to like look at the response, and then it's going to set some state, and then it re-renders. And if you ever try to do that declaratively, not imperatively, it's weird. Like you do like you set is saving to true, and then you have like an
effect. Basically, you would have an effect like
that says like, oh, when is saving goes to true, I want to start sending data to the server. And then like,
dude, it's an impedance mismatch. It's a total impedance mismatch. Super awkward. And people do that all the time.
Yeah. It's not like you kind of get nudged there when you look at a bunch of declarative APIs.
Right.
And also too, you think like, oh, I've had a lot of success being declarative.
Exactly. The declarative stuff has saved my butt so many times.
Yeah. So I think there's like just an interesting thing here where it's like, if it's not changing state, it's not a transition, as you said.
It's an event, and it's an
event.
Dan
so
Abramov,
you be imperative. Like you should feel like you actually want to be imperative here.
I agree, man. I totally agree. Dan Abramov has been writing the beta React docs about events versus effects, and it's like all of this stuff is like it's dead on, because if you have an event that happens once as a result of a user interaction, like a click, you want to write a handler, an event handler, and an event handler is a set of imperative code. If you want to synchronize your UI with some system that's changing, so when the system changes, your UI should update. That isn't what a use effect is for in React. That's an effect. But it's two very different things, even though it's like it's easy to get confused, because it's like, well, I'm rendering this component of the screen, I need to fetch data. So like, is the render an event that happened and now I can go fetch data? Well, no, actually, like rendering happens not as a result of user interaction. Like now you're in React's ball court. They're the one controlling rendering and re-rendering, and so your job is to tell it what should be rendered to the screen. That's like the reactive stuff. That's an effect. But when you submit a form, even though you're sending data, you're doing the same thing. You're using fetch. You're using fetch in both places, but it's a completely different domain space. The user has done something that leads to a set of a series of steps happening. So that's an event handler. That's imperative code. So even though the imperative code ends up looking very similar, you write fetch. You literally use the browser fetch API. If you look at the code you wrote, it's in an effect that reruns when there's dependencies. So that whole chunk of code is declarative code, even though there are imperative steps in the middle. Whereas the handler is literally an imperative function. So it's still that split, even though they use some of the same APIs. So it's really interesting. So all that to say, when I was trying to do this with the declarative pieces of Framer motion and getting it to kick off like basically a wave animation or a glow animation, it was really hard. So then I dropped down a level, and Framer motion has use animation controls. And that's the imperative API. And that's what we try to like stay away from, in a sense, because we know the declarative stuff helps you so much, and the docs even say if you can do declarative state-based stuff, you should, but only if it's appropriate. And in this case, it's not. So it's actually pretty interesting, man. It really is the event versus effect discussion. And clicking a button is an event. And so what I do right alongside my like use button from Aria and use focus ring, you just use animation controls. You throw that onto your motion dot button. You change the button to motion dot button. You do controls equals animation controls. And now you can say controls dot animate, controls dot start, controls dot cancel. And so on click, you can do controls dot, and then you can pass a keyframe, an array of like keyframes or whatever you want to do, and animate the background to like a darker thing, and then back to the original over 500 milliseconds, and then run your click handler. But now my button is even better than the Spectrum button because you tap it and it has that really satisfying press, regardless if you barely tap it. Or what's really cool, dude, is actually these things. These libraries are so good. The boundaries are so amazing because I have my use button, and I have on press start, on press end, and I use that to set the background color with framer motion immediately so that when you tap it and hold it, it's there. When I do on press end, I animate it back. So when you drag off, just like in the calculator, you slowly animate it down. So I'm using the imperative animation controls from framer motion in the events, the unified press event interface that React Aria is giving me. And then on press is what triggers if you happen to release the mouse or finger and actually trigger the button. And that's when I also animate it back from wherever value it is back to the original one. So it's pretty awesome. I'm pretty happy with it. Again, there's like, and you might look at this and be like, am I...
Great composition story, by the way.
It's such an awesome composition story. It really is. And all of those pieces where I need to change the styling, I'm using Tailwind classes. Every API gives me Tailwind. It gives me the ability to add and remove class names super easily. It's really, really cool. You might look at that and say, like, really every button is going to use, well, first of all, I mean, for me, like framer motion is like a default install at this point, but every button needs to basically use this base button, which uses React Aria and framer motion, and basically has a few like CSS rules applied to it, whether you're using Tailwind or not, like the touch move none thing so that it doesn't scroll when you drag it. And I mean, that's just, if you want it to feel really good, that is the answer. And like, I think I used to be more, I don't know, like really every button, but like you don't have a lot of buttons in your app. You don't have thousands, you're not rendering thousands of buttons. So if you just use a button like this, all of this is headless, right? You can wrap this. This is going to be the end of the video. It's going to be like the headless version of this. Well, it basically is. I mean, you just extract it out, and then it works. But you don't have that many buttons in your app. So if this had to be every button you use, and if you're a big enough company or working on a big project, you probably already have a button in your design system. It's no problem at all, and it's going to be way better in every device. So yeah, I'm never going to render another button element again. Basically, is what I'm saying.
Nice.
Not directly.
I think there's definitely like trade-off to be made here.
Yeah,
where you can say I'm writing like web UIs that I'm mainly using on my phone, and I really value these subtle interactions. I think they're important, and like I have a good way of getting the APIs to do this into my apps, and so you're only going to write buttons like this going forward,
right?
I think there you can have like an answer here that's like, well, I have like a React app that I'm working on once a year,
like front end first admin, right? Like our admin app.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just thinking, like, I'm pretty sure. Where is the admin? There it is. I'm pretty sure, like, you could just. I'm hoping to end up with a button that I just use by default going forward on my projects. I'm just kind of saying that like a little tongue in cheek, but I would like to replace it in my projects and see how it works, because even just since I've been doing this, even today during the podcast, poking around websites, you press and hold on a button. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. You know.
I know.
It's just interesting.
It's an interaction you want, but there is a trade off.
There, of course, there's a trade off.
The maintenance burden is.
Oh yeah,
if you're working on a React app that you touch like once a year, you don't want to have to like npm install next year, and you don't know like the state of things. Like
right.
It's just the more libraries you introduce, like you run that risk. So
totally. One reason why I like where this ended up is because framer motion, like I said, is basically in all my projects. And I think React Aria might start making it into a lot of them because it had a lot of really useful stuff.
Cool.
But yes, absolutely, there's a trade-off. Anyway, so yeah, that's going to be my next video. And it's been fun learning about this stuff. So
Nice.
Hopefully
Yeah,
that was
this is
interesting. I don't know if that was completely boring, but
great. No, dude, I found that extremely interesting.
cool. Thanks. Well, you should come work with me.
Yeah. I'll help you create your 12th button.
Right, exactly. Cool. All right, it's meeting time. Hey, thanks everybody. Sorry, it's been a few weeks, but here we are, and we'll see you. We'll plan on seeing you next week. Isn't that right?
Yeah, we'll be here next week.
Definitely. Cool. All right, thanks for listening. Catch y'all later. Bye bye.
See ya.